Excellent. Right. Welcome everybody to webinar 11. If you are just joining us for the first time, welcome. If you have gone to every single webinar, then you've done better than I have. So welcome. In usual fashion, we will talk about what we've had for our tea, or if you're very, very busy multitasking, what would you like for your tea? It might not be the same as what you're going to get for your tea, but what you've had for your tea, what you would like for your tea, or what you're going to have for your tea. So let's see, can people put things in the chat? Can they talk to us? Let's have a look. What are people saying?
Had pizza.
And
Sarah
and
Harrison
Jerry's.
has had pizza. Sarah Harrison must be banned from the next one, please, unless you've had pizza delights.
Yeah, sorry about that, but yeah, if you have pizza, you're banned.
Oh, somebody else has had
Actually,
pizza.
not actually. Siobhan, edit that
Weetabix.
out.
Chinese
Excellent.
takeaway at so. Oh my god.
Lovely.
Excellent, excellent. Pie and mash. Excellent. And kind of in the tradition that we've created over the short number of weeks we've been doing the webinars, tell us where you're from. Chicken tikka from Bradford. I'm assuming that's what you've had for your tea, not your name.
Okay, thanks Kelly. I love that. See you again next Wednesday to talk about food. I love that aspect there, Kelly. So if everybody switches off their microphone except Annie and myself, that would be great. The number in the session it's still going up all of the time, but we will make a start because we have a lot to get through tonight. So I know lots of you are regular attenders of the Social Work Student Connect webinars, but there's perhaps some people who are here for the first time. So I'll just give a very quick introduction to me. My name's Siobhan McLean. I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for 30 years now. I do a lot of work now working with students and newly qualified workers, and I'm particularly interested in theory and reflection in social work. So we've been doing these webinars. This is now our 11th week. We started them fairly early in lockdown to try and support students and new workers and all social workers really to keep connected with each other and to keep their practice connected with theory. So tonight's session is looking at social work assessment. We're going to be thinking about some theory, some practice, but mostly experience, because we have a very special guest with us who is going to be talking about experience and theory and practice. So we've got all three of those coming up tonight. So very much based around threes tonight, because we've got theory, practice and experience. There's three key aspects of assessment for the webinar tonight. And the webinar will come in three parts. So we're going to start off with Annie's introduction to herself, and then we're going to have a bit of a reminder of the theories and models of assessment in social work. For some of you that will be very much a refresher, for others it might be some aspects of it that are new to you. And then we're going to conclude the session tonight with some do's and don'ts, or maybe an alternative phrase of that is Annie's advice on assessment. So I think the first thing and the most important thing, as our numbers are continuing to go up, we've now got 338 people with us. I'm going to just ask Annie if she would introduce herself to everybody tonight.
Hi everyone, so thank you very much for having me, Siobhan. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's not at all scary that there's this vast numbers of people, although it's really interesting to find out what everyone's had for their tea. If you have had pizza, consider us enemies, because I have not had my tea yet. But I am now very hungry, so thank you for that. So good evening to you all. I hope you're all well. Thank you all for joining us. It's really lovely to be here. And so my name is Annie, and I am the writer and founder of Surviving Safeguarding, which is a parent's guide to the child protection process. And the reason that I wrote Surviving Safeguarding, or I started to write Surviving Safeguarding back in 2014, was that I am also a mum who has been through many, many years of intervention by the local authority into my family life. Some of it wanted and some of it not wanted and unwelcome. And it really started from my own childhood, where I was in the foster care system myself, and then left this system to become a care leaver, but was very much sort of cast out and left in the cold, really, as a care leaver. Didn't have a great experience in terms of entering the adult world. Became a mum at 16 and didn't have very much support, didn't have very much help, and struggled. And used the local authority as help and support, and they were very helpful, and they were very, very supportive of me, and helped me at times that I really did struggle with my children, with my mental health, and with the general sort of day-to-day parenting. So in many respects, the local authority were very, very helpful to me. And that unfortunately changed around about 2012, or slightly before then, when I wasn't really getting any better, and my issues and some of my choices left a lot to be desired, quite frankly. And I did fail my children, and I'm not ashamed to. I am ashamed of failing my children, but I'm not ashamed to admit that, because I think it's very important to be very honest, and I'm not here to be anything other than that. So the local authority then changed their approach to me, and care proceedings were issued after I suffered a pretty severe breakdown in mid-2012. And during that time, my life was very chaotic, and I was still making some really poor choices, and I fell pregnant again. I was the subject of many, many assessments, which is one of the reasons I'm here to talk to you tonight. And one of those was a pre-birth assessment in respect to my unborn baby. That assessment was negative. My baby went on to be removed at birth. He was 6 days old when he was taken from me, with an ultimate plan of adoption. And it was back at a time when it was very difficult to have a newborn return to your care. Things have slightly changed because of certain case laws, and because the system has humanised more than it was sort of 8 years ago. I've certainly seen a massive difference in the 5-6 years that I've been working with social workers and with families. I worked extremely hard. I decided to change my life and really look inward to see what actually I could do to make my situation different and my family situation better. And I needed to make a lot of reparations in terms of my children. I needed to put a lot of work in to look after my children in a better way. And after 258 days of very hard work, very hard slog, my baby was returned to me, and he's been with me ever since, and that was 7 years ago. We haven't had a social worker for 6 years, and I have worked very hard to maintain my mental health. I began writing as a way of trying to provide parents and families with another voice. What I had noted during my proceedings was that there was an inordinate amount of negativity towards social workers and the child protection system in general, and there was not a huge amount of insight and allowances that actually we're human and we do mess up, but what we often need is support and help. There wasn't that narrative, so my viewpoint was that actually what I needed to do was try to empower parents with the knowledge to help them navigate the system, but then also go on further to help them think about the changes that they could make in their lives, and to work with the local authority to maintain and sustain those changes for the good of themselves and of course their children. So that's why I launched Survive and Safeguarding, and have now trained tens of thousands of social workers across the UK and internationally. 2 years ago, I became a member of the Family Justice Council. I'm the parent and relatives representative, so I have a direct link to the judiciary, and I am on several working groups there. I work with domestic abuse and several other parties as well. And I'm really trying to change things from the inside, and have never forgot parents along the way. Have worked with parents for many, many years for free, trying to help people to think about what they could do differently and how to get parents or families and social workers to then work together. So that's a very long-winded intro, but essentially in a nutshell, that is me.
Thanks for sharing that, Annie. It wasn't long-winded at all. It was fascinating, and you can, even though you know, we're all sort of sitting in our bedrooms and our lounges and things, you can still feel that you can hear a pin drop in the room almost. So thank you very much for sharing that, and I know that you have so much to share with us tonight, and that everybody really appreciates your work, both with social workers and with parents, and I think that's key. So I know that you're going to bring a lot of that with us tonight. So we're going to start off with a bit of theory, really, I suppose a reminder of the theory. And in many ways, assessment is really the bread and butter of social work practice. But even though it's the bread and butter, it's well worth revisiting some of those things. So even if you've been a social worker for many years, it's worth revisiting some aspects of the theory around social work assessment. So this is a quote now from, well, almost 20 years old, isn't it? But I think it's still very relevant as a quote. So it comes from the Social Care Institute of Excellence, and they say, although assessment has been recognised as a core skill in social work and it should underpin all social work interventions, there's no singular theory or understanding as to what the purpose of assessment is and what the process should entail. So I think there's still this scattering really of theory around social work. There's nothing that's clear. And although tonight we're going to be talking a lot about theory in relation to children and their families, actually all of the theory is very generic theory, and there's a great deal of learning that you can take from that. So thinking about theory and assessment, really all of the theory and the traditional views of assessment, if you like, usually focus on process issues, either seeing assessment as part of the social work process or a consideration of the process of assessment. So pretty much all of the theory fits into one of those two areas really. So it'll either look at assessment as part of a process, or it will think of process of assessment. And that whole element, to me, and the illustration I suppose on this slide, is, to me, it always feels a bit scientific when we talk about that process issues. It always feels a bit like, well, where are the people here? You know, let's not lose sight of people within a process. And sometimes I think people get themselves so tied up in the process. And I hear social workers talk about, well, I've done that bit, I've done that bit. It's almost like just form filling starts to lead the assessment. So if we just look at the theory, I suppose, in those two parts to start off with, assessment often seen as part of the social work process, then if you go, you know, quite a long way back really, Taylor and Devine talk about this, but you can trace it back to earlier as well, then assessment is generally seen as a key part of the social work assessment process. So Taylor and Devine refer to it as the basic helping cycle. But, you know, I've been qualified for 30 years, and I remember I did a 4-year course. I remember 34 years ago being taught this stuff, that assessment is the first thing that we do with people, but that also assessment is constant and ongoing, and assessment should carry on through the whole of your work with people. But assessment is often seen as the beginning of a process, so that we should do assessment, then reach some sort of recommendation, then we plan around that, we intervene in a situation, and then we review what impact that intervention has had, and that might lead us into a reassessment of the situation. And that's very, you know, that goes back to 1993, but if you continue to look, it's all the same kind of stuff that you see. So aspire, assert, it makes it sound really, you know, I think the use of those sort of mnemonics make it sound like this is something really complex, but actually all this is very similar around looking at assessment as being the beginning of a social work process. And in many, oh, sorry, go on.
Jump in and ask you, do you think that that's accurate? Do you think that the assessment part is actually the start? Or do you think there's something that comes before that?
Well, I suppose what I think comes before that is, what should come before that is build a relationship. But that's not often what comes before that. Often what comes first is, in many ways, social workers gathering information before they even make contact with an individual. So I think that gathering of information aspect starts first. I suppose though, from my perspective, I think the way we see assessment as the start of a process, and maybe we are assessing from the minute we receive a referral, Annie. You know, if I, as a social worker, I'm sitting at a desk, I receive a phone call, which is a referral, or something lands in my inbox, which is a referral, immediately I'm starting to assess the situation as I'm reading it. What do I think is happening here? So I suppose assessment is always there at the beginning, but I don't think it should be seen as the start of a process, because sometimes an assessment is enough in itself. And for me, I think a good assessment is actually an intervention in its own right, if you like, because sometimes when you go through an assessment, if you can enable people to reflect for themselves and learn what needs to be changed for themselves, then we don't need to do the planning and the intervention and the review. Assessment can stand alone, but only if it's a good assessment. But I think the problem with it being seen as part of a process is people go out looking for the assessment. They're almost asking themselves, what do I need to do? Rather than let's just sit with this assessment and see what comes out of it. That because they see it as the beginning of this process, it's almost like, what should I do next? What should I do next? So I think that's one of the problems with this, seeing assessment as the beginning of a process, and maybe just helping us more to think about the skills that social workers have in assessment should be that this assessment could be a service in its own right. You know, families can really benefit from a really good assessment. I mean, I'm just drawing back to thinking about my own experiences, because I suppose we're drawing on experiences here, but they're very different. My experiences after I had my stroke, which I know you know all about, Annie, but then the best assessment that I had didn't lead to anything, but it enabled me to relearn. I had a social care assessment that was all about what support do we need to give you, and it was very process driven, and it felt like I was just being processed through something. I had a really good OT assessment that really enabled me to learn about my own circumstance and what I could change and what I could do, and that was a great assessment, and to me that was a better service than anything else I got. So I think an assessment can be a service in its own right, I suppose. But that's the bit about assessment at the beginning of a process. Then if we look at the process of assessment, now I know both of us, Annie, have a lot to say about this particular slide, but this is Milner and O'Byrne, which is a very popular social work assessment textbook for students. And for quite a long time, I mean, this is taken from a later edition, so 2009, but they started writing about this much earlier. And they talk about assessment as having 5 stages. The first stage being preparation. So think about, you know, they're saying that a social worker should think about who do they need to see? Why are they doing the assessment? What information they need to gather? So it's a kind of plan for the assessment. What do I need to be doing? In lots of ways, those of you who've attended all the webinars might recognise that as that's reflection for action, the reflection you do before a piece of work. Then they talk about data collection. So collect the information, and that's where you gather the information that you need. A good assessment plan helps you to think about and gather and structure that collection of information. Then they say stage 3 is weighing up the data. So they say at this point, the social worker weighs up the information to reach an answer to the essential question, is there a problem and is it serious? So at this point, we're weighing up the information that we've gathered. Then they say analyze the data. So here they're saying the information is interpreted so that the social worker can gain a fuller understanding and develop ideas for intervention. And then the 5th stage, they say, is utilising the data. And that's when we finalise judgments that we make, and we maybe use the information to evidence the judgments and the recommendations for intervening. So that's the process of assessment that a lot of social work training includes, that kind of process of assessment. So what are your thoughts about that, Annie? I mean, we've had a conversation, haven't we, about this, but I don't know if you wanted to say anything at this point.
I hate the word data. I really hate the word data. It's difficult for me to think about my life as being full of data to be extracted from me in order to be put in a document form, and then used to inform a decision which is going to be made about me. There seems to be a lot of doing without me, and not a great deal in this model about working with me. And at least its saving grace is that it has the preparation, but that again doesn't talk about what happens when you come into my home. What's the first question you ask me when you sit down on my sofa? That's the sort of thing that matters to me, not what data you are going to extract and stick in a report. That, whilst that matters in terms of is it accurate, and does it reflect what I perceive to be the problems, or I perceive to be some issues or some things that I can work on, or maybe some strengths. There doesn't again seem to be a massive amount about strength in this, and we all have strengths, even if we're really struggling, we still have strengths. So I am not a huge fan. I can understand it. I think in the chat somebody had said it's very medicalized. I would agree, but the language that's used is very, it others people, and it others the families and the adults, the children that you work with, so this is very far from what I would see as being, it would no doubt be a very efficient assessment, but I don't think it would leave me feeling like I had been helped or that I understood what to do next. I would struggle with this one, I think, Siobhan.
Yeah, I agree. It's that word data, isn't it? It really sort of drags, and it does feel as though this is something that is being done to somebody rather than being done with somebody. And interesting there, the way you use that word, where you said, I don't feel I would have been helped with this. If we go back to the process of assessment and where that started, it's called the helping cycle. That's where this is supposed to be about helping and supporting people, not going in and doing something to somebody. And I think it can feel a bit like that. And I was thinking, when I was preparing for this, I was thinking, I suppose it was at the end of last week, and it made me think about this tweet, that whole thought about just the word data. Made me think about this. That was a tweet that I saw ages ago, but it really captured me at the time. So in 2018, Michael Rosen, who's a children's author, said this. First, they said they needed data about the children to find out what they're learning. Then they said they needed data about the children to make sure they're learning. Then the children only learnt what could be turned into data. And then the children became the data. And I was thinking last week, and then the data was used to fail disadvantaged children and further advantaged children from private schools. That whole thing about data is, it's impersonalized. I think, as Annie has said, it others people. We're no longer talking about us. We're talking about, we're no longer talking about we, we're talking about us and them. And that's the quote of yours that I love the most, Annie, and I'm sure you'll share that later. But that whole aspect of data terrifies me, really. And the data, you can see the mix up that's occurred with data, and just data just simply becoming, there's a lack of people here. So let's think about maybe information rather than data. So if we're thinking about process issues, then when you and I have chatted, Annie, we've said, well, actually, our perspective on the process of assessment is maybe three things. So firstly, build the relationship, then gather the information, and that information should also include aspects of strengths, as you said, and then make a decision or a recommendation that you take forward for somebody else to make the decision. The decision isn't always a key part of the assessment. Sometimes the assessment is simply informing the decision-making process. So for us, it's those three things, that process of assessment. And the most important thing is the making of the relationship. So a little bit more about theory, but then I know really what everybody wants to hear about is Annie's advice. So I'm going to just quickly whiz through this, but I suppose coming from that three, leading us into another three is models of assessment. And now these go right back to, they're based on research in 1993, Smale et al. identified, what they did was they'd observed lots of social workers, but this was in adult services after the implementation of the NHS and Community Care Act. So we have to remember where it came from. And they identified 3 different models of assessment. They said there was a questioning model, a procedural model, and an exchange model of assessment that they noted in the social workers that they observed. And if we just look at that and what each of those models means, then in terms of the questioning model, this is one where the worker, so the social worker perhaps, holds the expertise, and they follow a format of questions where they are supposed to listen to and just kind of respond and process the answers. But I think it, from the other side, probably just feels like you're having questions fired at you. And I know, Annie, later you'll tell us about your experiences of that. But from the perspective of reading the literature, if you like, around this model, really it reflects the agenda of the worker. It does what the worker wants it to do. And I've noticed as a practice educator working with students and new workers that sometimes the way people prepare for assessments is to develop themselves a list of questions. Here's the questions I want to ask. And then it can feel very just question focused, one after another being fired at you. The second model they identified, they called the procedural model. And within this model, the worker is gathering information to make a judgment, but it's all focused on whether the person fits criteria, really. And in the procedural model, it feels quite tick boxy, and it's likely that lots of checklists and lots of kind of, I suppose, tools of assessment get used. And in a way, that reflects the agenda of the organisation. And then the third model that they identified was the exchange model. Now, the emphasis in this model is on exchanging information. So I think it feels much more like it's being done with the person. The worker follows what a person is saying, rather than trying to interpret what they think is being meant. They follow and track what the person is saying, and they go with that. And the worker should help the person to identify their strengths, their internal resources, and their potential. And that should reflect the agenda of the person who is being assessed. And when you read the literature, it generally sort of indicates that we should move towards the exchange model. Talking to a student in supervision last week, they said when they'd read around it, they felt like that was given like the gold star approach. You know, the exchange model is what we should aim for. And I do hear lots of people saying students start off with a questioning model and should work towards an exchange model. But actually, in my view, we probably need a bit of all of this in every assessment, because actually we need to address everybody's agenda. So there may be a need to use some checklists and criteria. There may be a need to utilise some clear questioning, especially when we're looking at aspects of risk. But then there's also a need for that exchange. So I'm whizzing through these because I really want to come to Annie's experiences. So I know she's probably going to refer back to these, aren't you, Annie, when talking about experiences? But just very quickly, just wanted to revisit what we've done in lots of the webinars about looking at the difference between a theory, a model, a method, and an approach. And what we've done is we've looked at models of assessment, so those 3 models of assessment, but then what about methods, and what should we do in terms of methods? And I just wanted to pull out really one method, which is triangulation. So in any assessment, what we should be drawing on is triangulation of evidence. There's really 3 sources of evidence in any assessment that we're doing. And maybe rather than think about this in terms of assessing a family or a child or an adult, I'm going to just think about this in terms of assessing a student social worker, because lots of you out there have been a student or are a student. So you've all been assessed. Your practice was assessed by another social worker. And what they were doing was, as a practice educator, I've done a direct observation of a student today. Now, it was a strange one because it was virtual, but I'm observing what does that student do. So I'm drawing on observation. And all of you will have put a portfolio together with some observation evidence in. There's also feedback evidence where we get feedback from others about that student's practice. And then there's product evidence. So we look at the product of their work. But that's just the same when we're assessing a family or an adult. We're looking at what do we see around us in the environment. We're looking at gathering feedback from the person, the family, but other professionals as well. And we're also looking at products like chronologies maybe, or other methods, tools that we've used. When we have all three sources of evidence, it gives us a stronger clarity of assessment. If we rely purely on one area, it limits the assessment more. This is a bit of a problem, I think, with virtual assessments at the moment, because we're not always able to see what we want. We don't always go into people's homes, and those things can have an impact. But triangulation is really important. So I wanted to just sort of bring it up and refer to it. But I have noticed when I talk to people about triangulation in assessment, sometimes they think I'm talking about this, which is the assessment framework for children's in England. But that's not to be confused with what I've just talked about, triangulation of evidence. This is looking at three different aspects, looking at a child's developmental needs, parenting capacity, and family and environmental factors. It certainly should not be confused with this one, another triangle that's used in assessment, the toxic trio. This one's referred to. I mean, imagine the language of this, which is largely blaming of mothers as well. I don't know what your thoughts are about the language around this.
It's interesting because I've been sort of watching you and watching the chat, and already we've had a few people say the dehumanizing nature of language sometimes within social work. You know, I have not been involved in substance misuse, but essentially the other two are me. And behind that triangle and that vile terminology of toxic trio is me, is a human, is a person. And I just think we need to be so careful of labels like the toxic trio, which instantly, because of the use of the word toxic, blame, shame, judgment, and these things really do matter. And we do hear them, families, parents and adults using services, we do hear these terms used. We don't always know what they mean, but toxic is never a good word. So your starter for 10 is that it's probably a criticism or a judgment. So be really, really aware of using terms like the toxic trio when you're talking about people. Instead, it could be this father has mental health issues, and this father is a victim of domestic abuse. This mother is misuses substances and has mental ill health as well. You don't need to label us as having toxic trio. I hate that. It's one of the very few phrases that I really can't stand.
I mean, it's just a horrible word, isn't it? And it's also, you know, been very criticised as largely blaming of mothers as well. So there's also that element of, you know, if you want to try and think about feminist practice and so on. So triangles, as you can see, are really popular in social work theories around assessment. You know, think about Cartman's drama triangle, think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think it's very easy, and it's sort of maybe appealing to social workers and to theorists to think about a triangle, but we've got to take a critical stance and look at what's missing. You know, the Child Welfare Inequalities Network is particularly critical of that concept of the toxic trio, because it says, well, those three, you know, are undoubtedly significant factors, but the key thing that's missing from there is the impact of poverty and insecurity, and the links between poverty and those three factors are not taken into account. So, you know, people say the toxic trio comes from research, but actually it misses out all of the research about poverty, because that isn't, you know, doesn't fit with the triangle. So always think about, take a critical stance. And particularly, I would suggest we need to take a critical stance around tools and checklists. So in fairly recent research undertaken around child sexual exploitation, then Brown et al. Found across England and Wales there were between 9 and 28 different assessment tools that were being used and checklists that were being used simply in relation to child sexual exploitation. So up to 28 different assessment tools. Imagine being someone and having those 28 tools used on you, you know, 28 different tools. And the way they're used is really varied. You know, the quotes there, in particular, we found the risk indicators being used varied considerably across the large number of tools. So examining 10 tools, they identified 110 different indicators. How many tick boxes is that? How much are we dehumanizing and not listening to people's individual experiences? And it's really important, as that quotation concludes there, that as social workers, we need to find out, what was this tool created for, and use it for what it was created for, rather than thinking, oh, this is a nice, it's almost like we get a bit tick box happy with all of these forms and, oh, let's tick a few more and let's tick a bit more. It becomes incredibly depersonalized. So finally, I suppose one thing we thought is important just to mention is this move at the moment towards virtual assessment, isn't it? Because everything is being done virtually. You know, we're doing all of this virtually. None of us are together. We're all doing it from our respective front rooms and things. In my perspective, what we need to do for virtual assessment is use the what, why, and how framework. You know, I've said before in previous webinars, what we do as social workers and why we do it is remaining the same during this pandemic practice. How we're doing it is changing rapidly. And I think in just the same way, what information we need to gather and why we need to gather it remains the same, but how we gather the information is changing. And Annie, I know you've been talking to some parents who are experiencing virtual assessments. How does it feel to be on the other side of the virtual box, tick box, if you like?
It's quite frustrating for many of the parents that that I've worked with and I talk to regularly. What they are experiencing is often a widening of the power dynamic and the mismatch of power between the social workers that are assessing you and your own self and your family, and the have and have-nots. So one of the things that's been quite difficult for families has been digital poverty, and the restrictions that puts on you. So I am very lucky in that in my job I need to use a laptop, so therefore I have a laptop in front of me which has a built-in camera. I have an office chair so I can sit and I'm comfortable and I can conduct a conversation reasonably well. I can use my hands, I'm quite comfortable. That's not the case when you are attempting to conduct an assessment whilst on your phone, perhaps with a camera, perhaps sometimes with our parents, they don't have phones with cameras, or they don't have enough data to be able to use those phones. So it's having to be done over the phone. But even if it is done by video call, imagine having to stand with your phone for an hour while your social worker sits and chats to you in a relatively comfortable environment that I am enjoying at the moment. That's really, really difficult, and it highlights more the difference between those who are being assessed and those who are assessing. So that's been one of the issues. The other issue has been the more obvious one, and that's around how can you be sure who is in the room, and how can you get an assessment accurate, if you can do such a thing, but how can you move towards more of a natural assessment when you don't know, you haven't got a clue who's behind my camera right now, there's nobody, but you only know that because I've told you. So how do we create an environment where if a social worker needs to talk to a family member, and that family member could be quite vulnerable, could be a mum, could be a dad, could be a young person, how do we know that there's not somebody the other side of that screen influencing what's been said? Now, the fact is we don't, but there are things that we can do differently, and what we need to try and create is an environment where that family member feels at their least vulnerable. That's really quite difficult and takes some skill, but that's one of the things that's coming out with parents. They're not necessarily saying, well, you know, I am a victim of domestic abuse, and instead of being able to talk freely, my partner stood behind the screen and I was not able to speak. I'm not getting reports as explicit as that. What I'm getting is it's really difficult for me to have a conversation with a social worker in private right now. So that, read into that what you will, but that is parents, family members telling me that they can't necessarily be themselves. The other thing to really be aware of as social workers is the huge amount of sensory information that you're missing by conducting a virtual assessment. So whilst it's absolutely right that in the same way you need the same information, you have got a gap in that information, and you need to be aware of that. So how else could you get that information? What do you need to change your questions? Because it's very difficult for us as parents. Before we came on, the people on the screen had said, you know, everything looks great. And I said, okay, hang on, I'm going to turn my camera around. And I showed, this is just toys. It's just toys. It's just chaos. But that's what that's what people don't see. So it's what are you missing, and how could I now feel comfortable enough in front of all of you to turn my camera around and show you what I'm seeing, and show you the truth, as it were, about the state of my living room. How do I do that? How do I feel safe enough to do that? So these are all holes that need to be filled, and you need to be mindful of these. So that's what I would probably say about virtual assessment in a nutshell.
Absolutely. And I think if we go back to where we started with the theory, because we're kind of ending the theory now and going into the experience bit, but if we go back to where we started, that assessment to gather information and then planning and then intervention and so on, I'm hearing so many stories about local areas where all of the professionals are in on a video type call using some sort of system like Teams or something like that, but parents are just on a telephone, you know, being sort of on speakerphone added in, and that's so, again, so different in terms of that power dynamic and how everybody can access it, and you can access in different ways. So professionals get to see one another, and yet the family are just listening in, and it's very, I think it's very stark at the moment, that digital poverty issue.
That's really coming the difference in terms of when you come to deliver a decision or a recommendation. What has been reported to me by parents is, well, the social worker ran around everybody, and I said, okay, so when did they get to you? Oh, well, I was last. Okay, so they'd run around to get everybody's recommendation, and they let you know the recommendation. How fair did that feel? You know, how would you have felt if you were sat in a room and the social worker just went out the room and checked? How would you feel? Would it feel different if that was a physical thing rather than the social worker just kind of ringing around? Because did the social worker say, could you trust that the social worker would not bring themselves or their recommendation into the help visitors or the school nurse or a teacher? How do you know, and how comfortable do you feel? Because this is about trying to work in partnership and trying to work as openly and honestly together. And how does that feel? And a lot of, well, the people that I've have worked with who've told me about this experience are very uncomfortable with the way that recommendations are being delivered at the moment. So we definitely need to think about how that's done. And the way that you describe it is something that I've also heard similar with coherence as well, where all the professionals are together and the family member is kind of left out in the cold, and that's very difficult because that's how it feels anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like a physical way of demonstrating how it felt anyway. So, it's enough of the theory really, but we've kind of refreshed the theory, but we're going to go to you sharing your experiences now, and I know that's why everybody's come tonight. So if it's over to you now, Annie.
Thank you. So I'm just going to talk you through some of my experiences. I don't intend on talking you through them all because we'll probably be here until about 1 AM and we've all got beds to go to. But I want to talk to you a little bit about some of my experiences of assessment. And I have been assessed throughout my life. So I was assessed as a child as being at risk and then removed from my home. I was assessed again whilst during my time in the foster care system and constantly assessed there. Very much on the outside, I felt as a young person. Now this was the sort of early 90s, so it's slightly different, I would hope anyway, in 2020. But that feeling of being on the outside is one that's very, very powerful, and it does stay with you. And then as an adult and being moved into motherhood, where you constantly feel assessed anyway. As soon as you fall pregnant, you are assessed by a midwife, by a doctor, by a health visitor, by her down the road who's got something to say and wants to tell you how you're ruining your child's life already when your child's the size of a grape and in your uterus. So you are constantly being assessed as a human anyway. Adding into that the trauma that that I have gone through in my childhood, and the fact that I would often respond with a trauma response meant that any assessments or any judgments cut me so much deeper. I never had approval as a child, and I would seek that from elsewhere. I would seek it from friends, from professionals all of the time, to try and know or have some sort of reassurance that I was a good person, that I was a decent human being, that I was doing things right, that I was a good mum. And it's very difficult when you haven't had that as a child to then feel confident and bold as an adult. And really what I had learned was was that you have to really fight for approval, and you have to learn the language, or you have to learn people, what people like, and then you mold yourself to them. So that's what I'd learned throughout my life, whether that was with men in relationships, with friends, which I really struggled to build and maintain relationships with friends because I didn't have the greatest start, and then moving on to professionals. So my involvement with the local authority started really around 2007, and that was at a period of time in my life when my mental health was not at its most acute. It was at its most acute at that point. It did get worse, but at 2007 I experienced essentially a breakdown, and my relationship with the local authority at that point was very much a rescuing relationship. So I reached out to them with, they still wore boots and capes as far as I was concerned, because they had rescued me as a child, which is a very dangerous narrative to have. But because of that, I felt safe enough to reach out for support, and they were supportive towards me, and they did help. However, I was the subject of an assessment back then, and what I was really struck with, and this kind of intervention and this period of time when I was involved with the local authority went on for essentially 4 or 5 years before things really came to a head. So within that time, we had so many social workers and so many different assessments, but one of the earliest ones that we had was that one of my children had additional needs and actually needed additional support and services. Because of my background, and for whatever reason, it was thought by the local authority, we will do a family assessment. There was an issue with one of my children, but they felt that actually we'll just assess all of them, because you never know, you might need some support. And I thought, okay, I'll go with that. I felt a little bit got at, but I thought, okay, we'll go with it. And a social worker I'd never met came into my home with a clipboard and a pen, and sat on the sofa opposite me, firing questions at me, which had nothing to do with my child's additional needs and nothing to do with any issues that I was having. So I was very confused by these questions. They ranged from, how often do you wash your towels? Now I sat back and I thought, right, there's a one, because I don't know the right answer to that question. If I say I wash them daily, which essentially was pretty much the truth. As soon as my kids had a bath, I would towel them down and shove it in the washer. And that's what I thought you did. I didn't realise that you could go more than one day. I didn't know that. Now, in my head, I did think that perhaps sounded excessive for an outsider. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to say that. And then I thought, well, hang on, if I say, what's the answer? If I say fortnightly, that's surely not often enough. So I can't say that. So shall I plump for in the middle? I'll plump for in the middle. So all of this is taken part in a split second in my head. And that was followed up with, how often do you wash your bed sheets? And I thought, oh God, here we go again. Well, I can't say daily, because that is a blatant lie. But I used to do them on a Saturday, and I thought, well, I don't know if other people do them on a Saturday, because I haven't had a family. I haven't seen adults do this, so I don't know if what I do is normal. And what I'm frightened of is that if I give the wrong answer, what are the consequences for me and my children and my family? Does this then mean they're going to come in and whip my kids away because I wash my towels every day and I wash my bed sheets on a Saturday? Is that the wrong thing to do? I don't know. And we kind of scraped through the assessment with some very odd questions that seemed to have no bearing on why the social worker was actually there. As it happened, the assessment was, I'll say, a positive one, but that's only because my child got what they needed and the social worker left the rest of us alone. Had it have been a different outcome, I'm not sure I would be saying that was a positive assessment, because to me, that was what I wanted. Help my child. I don't need your help. If I need your help, I'll ask for it, but I don't at this stage need your help. And I know what I need because I'm the expert in my life. So, and I know what my children need and what my family needs. And actually talking about towels isn't really very helpful, and it's a waste of both of our times. That really reflects when we think about when we're thinking about the different models, that's the agenda of the organisation. That's the agenda of the worker. That's nothing to do with me. That's a tick box. That's a box that that social worker has to tick to say that they've asked that question. Why it needed to be done, was it ever explained to me? Of course it wasn't. And as I've learned that it wasn't necessary, it didn't need to be there. Anyway, so that was the outcome of that assessment. And I really wanted to talk to you as well about another assessment which was conducted in respect of me, and that was in respect of my child, and that was a pre-birth assessment, unborn assessment. What I'd like to share with you is a picture. Now, this picture to me represents the feeling around a pre-birth assessment. Many things happened during the pre-birth assessment. It was during a time of my life that it was very chaotic. I was in the middle of care proceedings in respect of my older children, as I alluded to in the beginning. But I was also preparing for the birth of a child who I did not know would come home. I knew that he may come home, and therefore I had to prepare for him coming home, because if I didn't, then that would be used against me within that assessment. So I went out and I sold clothes, I sold underwear, that's quite a market, but I sold things on eBay in order to get these things for my child, and to show the social worker and to show anybody who wanted to come into my living room and have a look that I had made the right preparations for my child. I didn't do that because for any other reason than that's what I felt like I had to do. I had no idea if this child was coming home, and if it was up to me, I would have rather waited, because that was incredibly painful to have to look at every single day. And actually, the outcome that we had, as you will know, was that my child didn't come home when he was born. So I had to walk back into that house at 6 days postnatal, having had my child taken out of my arms. And that was the first thing that I saw. And that was there to please the social worker and to tick a box on a form. And it wasn't about me, and it wasn't about my child. And of course, the right thing to do was to make sure that he had somewhere to sleep. But, you know, babies have slept in drawers before. It's not the end of the world. This wasn't about my child. This was what it represented. So I really wanted to share that with you, to start to think about the feelings around assessment, because as we've seen within theory, it's a very mechanical approach, and it can feel, when we talk about data, when we talk about information, can we think about stories, that these are my stories, that this is my life, and this is what I want to talk to you about, and this is what I want to share. And how do you, as a worker, create that environment where I feel comfortable enough to tell you a story? Brené Brown talks about us being programmed as humans to tell stories, and of course we are. We all love to talk about our lives, ourselves, our experiences, and we love to hear about other people's experiences. So it's no different, and that is a great tool to use in assessment, the use of stories. How can you allow this person to tell you a story? Can you become enthralled in that story? Can you feel some of the feelings that that story is bringing up for that person who's telling it? Can you feel the vulnerability that it must take for that person to tell you that story? These are the things that are important to us, and these are the things that, when it comes to learning about assessment, that are really key. So I wanted to share that with you. And I wanted you to think a little bit about the feelings. And what I want to do next is a little bit of an exercise. So you will know that I can't see you. However, I do have lists of names. So what I want to do is just take a moment to do an exercise with you. So I would like you to ignore everything that's going on around you. I would like you to close your eyes for a second and just listen to me. So I'd like all of you to do it, Siobhan, you included. I am watching your eyes. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Siobhan's now taking the glasses off to demonstrate her eyes are closed. So I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think about your deepest, darkest secret, something that you don't share. And I want you to just feel that secret for a moment, and feel everything that's going on in your body right now, just thinking about that. It might be a memory. It might be something that you have concealed from everyone. It might be something that you don't like to talk about. It might be an opinion that doesn't go down well. It might be just something that's very uncomfortable. Now, I just want you to sit with that for a moment. Try to sit in the moment with that, please. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick one of you. I'm going to read a name out. And when I do that, I would like that person to share that secret with all of us. So how does that feel? Think about how that feels right now. At any moment, I'm going to read your name out. If we were in a room together, I would be walking amongst you, and at any moment, I would be tapping one of you on the shoulder. How does that feel? Somebody's saying terrified, sheer panic. Okay. Open your eyes. I'm not going to pick on any of you, partially because I can't actually see the names. I lied. Sorry about that, parents lie. So I'm not going to do that. What I want you to do is immediately think about, what would you have done if I'd picked on you? Would you have told me the truth? Would you have not told me the truth? This is your first poll. I would like you to engage in this poll right now. I'll give you a moment to do that.
So I'm just going to talk about the poll, Annie, because not everyone can see the poll and certainly the results. So there is a poll up that says, would you tell the truth? Would you make something up or lie? Or would you refuse to answer? And at the moment, we've got 250 responses in, and at the moment it's sitting at 14%. Of the people would tell the truth, 42% of people would make something up or lie, and 45% of people would refuse to answer. So it's still sitting at around about that same number, even though we've now got 305 people answered. It's around about, it stayed pretty consistent at 14% of people would tell the truth, 41% would make something up, 45% would refuse to answer.
Isn't that interesting? So the second poll, so if you didn't get a chance to answer that one, please do involve yourself in the next one. Your second poll is why? Why would you? So the majority of people, and kudos to those who said they would tell the truth. I'm not entirely sure I believe you, but but I will say, okay, you know, I will listen and say that 14% of people have said they will tell the truth. Fantastic, you should all be politicians instead of social workers. But for those that said that they would either refuse to answer, or they would lie, or they would make something up, why? Tell me why. Was it embarrassment? Was it fear? Was it shame? It might have been all three, but I didn't do an option for that, sorry. Which one was it? What was the strongest factor for you?
And so I'll just again explain the poll is, we've got at the moment 266 people have answered, and 24% of people are saying it was embarrassment, 28% of people saying fear, and 48% of people saying shame impacted on their answer, which is very interesting because, Annie, as you will know, our webinar next week is all about the impact of shame in social work, and there 49% of people, it was shame that was the biggest factor for them.
Yeah, and that is, I have to say, the biggest factor for the majority of us. Shame is such an excruciatingly painful emotion to feel. And it's something that does not go. It stays with you forever. You might think that I'm this super confident person because I'm on the screen and I'm able to talk to you about some of my deepest, darkest secrets. That doesn't mean I don't feel shame. It's still there. It won't ever go. So that's something that certainly for next week, you can think about more, you can talk about more with Siobhan next week. So I'm glad that we did that exercise. I'm sorry that it felt so uncomfortable, but some of those feelings, it's helpful for us as family members and for users of services, for you to have felt them. It's because then you will know how it then feels to have somebody come into your home and expect you to divulge your deepest, darkest secret. So one thing I want to talk to you briefly about, and I'm mindful of time, but one thing I do want to talk to you about, which is very, very important to me, whether you saw our tweets earlier or not about what have towels got to do with assessment? Well, we've answered that. What has the number 3 got to do with assessment? And then what's cups got to do with assessment? So I want to introduce an object to you. And I know that if you've been with the webinars before, you have done objects in social work. Well, this is an object in my life that's very important. And I had to go off camera before because I actually forgot to bring it into the room. So I apologise for that. But this is a very, very, very special cup. So I'm hoping that you can all see it. If you can't see it, this is a black cup with a Batman logo on it. It's got a broken handle which has been fixed. This is a very, very important cup to me. This sits on my desk above my computer, and I look at it every single day. There has not been a day gone by that I haven't looked at this cup for a long, long time. And the reason for that is that this belongs to my late son, Johnny. He died. He left us just over 3 years ago, and I miss him every single day. He was my best friend and my biggest supporter. I had him when I was 16, and I will never not go an hour, I think, without thinking about him. So I miss him huge, huge amounts. That's him behind us that you can see. And a lot of this is his belongings here. But this is a particularly special item. Now, I know Siobhan pretty well. In fact, Siobhan came to my son's funeral. That's how well I know Siobhan. We've been friends for a long time, and I trust Siobhan. So if I was to give Siobhan this cup, I would know that if Siobhan needed to take this cup anywhere, first of all, if I handed her this cup, I know that Siobhan would treat it with reverence. She would treat it carefully. She would be very, very gentle with the cup. She would certainly not fling it about the countryside. But also, if she needed to take the cup somewhere, I would know that Siobhan would wrap this in bubble wrap. She would put it in a box, and she would be likely to put it very carefully in her car. She would probably let me know when the cup had arrived at its destination. And she would probably, if she needed to bring the cup back, which one hopes she would, then she would let me know when it was on its way back. And then, of course, hand it very carefully back to me when she arrived back at my home. Now, I would give Siobhan that cup because I trust Siobhan. I know her very well, and I know that she would look after this. Now, I don't know Omar. I know him from Twitter. And I've met him this evening in person, and it's a great pleasure to meet you, Omar, you and your fan club. But I don't know Omar, and I would not give Omar this cup. I would not know what he would do with it. I don't know how he would treat this cup, or whether he would look after it, what he would do with it, who he would give it to. Would it be passed around the office? I don't know. I'm not sure. Would it come back in this state? I don't know. I don't know Omar. I'm sure he's a lovely person. I'm absolutely positive he's a lovely guy, but I don't know him. So why on earth would I give him this cup? Now, I want you to think about this cup as my information. So when you're trying to extract data or information from a family member, if you can think about this cup, what are the variables in me giving you that information? I don't know you. I don't trust you. We've not necessarily, I've built a very short relationship with Omar, but I haven't built a relationship in the way that I have with Siobhan. There hasn't been time. So if Omar was coming in to do an assessment or to take this cup from me, I would really struggle with that. So as social workers, how do you create that environment really quite quickly where we know that this cup would be looked after? How would you do that? So these are the things to think about. Of course, it's important to think about the theory. Of course, it's important to think about what you need to get done in your assessment. But what's also important for us is what you do with my information. Where does it go? Who's going to look at it? Who's going to talk about it? Is anybody going to laugh? Is anybody going to judge or say, oh, well, isn't she strange having her dead son's cup next to her? Isn't she strange for having this aspect of her personality? Oh, she's got this aspect of her personality. She must be X, Y, Z. That's how it feels for us to give you information. We have to trust you, and we have to know what you're going to do with it. And actually, when you've got that information, we need to know where it goes. We need to know that you're going to be careful with it and you're going to look after it, and that actually you're going to bring it back to us. So when you conduct an assessment, it's not just about the beginning of the assessment and the building of the relationship and the extracting of data. It's also about what happens next and how you then get from here to here, how you get from building a relationship to delivering a recommendation, how you get to coming into my home and getting me in a position where I trust you enough to give you my cup, to then giving me that cup back with a few recommendations around that cup. How do you do that? So that's the sort of thing that I want you to think about when it comes to assessment, when it comes to working with people. This is really precious to me, but equally my information, my stories are really precious to me too. So I'm going to go on to some do's and don'ts. And this is essentially a list which I'm sure will go out to you tomorrow in your email. So I'll talk very, very quickly around the list. First of all, do consider how you enter our homes. That's not about, you know, do you take shoes off, although that's really important. Some people, particularly culturally, will expect or want you to take your shoes off. So make sure you've not got a manky pair of socks on that have got a hole in. But consider how you enter our homes. How would you enter the home of somebody you didn't know, or you didn't have a relationship with? You would ask where to sit. You would let them lead you. All of these things show us that we have the power in our own home. You're coming onto our turf, and you need to respect that. It's really very important to us. Check where to sit. Ask if it's okay to get your laptop out if that's what you're doing. Comment on the home, comment on how pretty it is, or that this is a particularly nice picture on the wall, that's lovely. Consider how you enter our homes. How do you come into our lives? Don't refuse a cup of tea. So this is a very key one with families, with adults using services, actually with children too. If they're old enough to make you a cup of tea, drink it. But actually, even if you don't want the cup of tea, the cup of tea isn't a cup of tea to us. It's quite symbolic, because I have made social workers' cups of tea where it has been my last tea bag. And that isn't a lie designed to fit in with this workshop. That is the absolute truth. I've tried to impress somebody by giving them my last tea bag, and they've never said a word, and they'll never know. And if they're watching, they won't know it's them. Don't refuse that cup of tea, because that might be our last one. And also it shows us that you're willing to come into our world. If you don't want to drink the tea, that's fine. You can leave it on the side and you can say, oh, dear me, I forgot about my tea. That's perfectly fine. You don't necessarily have to drink the tea. Just don't refuse it. It's respectful. So acknowledge the power dynamic. Do acknowledge the power dynamic. That's a really important one. We do have power. There is a power mismatch. There's no point in trying to deny it. It's very important that it does not become the elephant in the room. It's very important that we acknowledge that it's there. The parent or family member or adult might be very concerned about what you do with your power and how you wield that power. As a parent, as a mum, I was always very scared that whatever I said was going to be used against me and they would come and take my kids away, because I knew that they had the power to do that. Social workers have got the power to remove my children. Granted, they've got to go through court or the police, but actually the media doesn't show me that bit. The media and Coronation Street or EastEnders or, you know, the Daily Mail, they don't show me that process. What they show me is evil social worker coming into my home to take my child. So you are already pushing water uphill in terms of what I might know about the social worker and their power. So you have to acknowledge the power dynamic. You have to say that it's there. If the parent is really worried about, oh God, you know, you can remove my kids, address it. There's nothing to be gained from pretending it's not happening. It's okay to say, okay, tell me your worries. What is it that's worrying you? Right, let's work that through. I can't come in here today and remove your kids. That ain't going to happen. First of all, I don't want to do that. That's not why I'm here. But secondly, there's a whole process that we need to go through and we are not there yet. So that's a way, a very easy, simple way of trying to reassure a parent or a family member that you're not there to do that. Don't expect too much too soon. So we've talked about the cup. Please don't come into our living rooms and think that we're immediately going to tell you our deepest, darkest secret, because we're not going to. You'll need to put the work in. You'll need to put some of the foundations of our relationship in first. Choose your language carefully. This has been brought up in the chat already. It's something that's a huge bugbear of mine. Please be careful about the language that you use. Think about it beforehand. Does this sound right? If I talk about outcomes, or do I talk about what I want for this family? What would I love to see you do, Mrs. Smith? What would I love for you to achieve, Mrs. Smith? Let me help you do that. Choose your language carefully. Please don't take notes without sharing them with us. I have been in many meetings, many conferences, and have been assessed where the notes that appeared afterwards via post had bore no reflection on what actually my experience of that meeting was. So make sure if you are taking notes, you just check with the parent. And if you need to do that virtually right now, you can do that virtually. Just check with the parent. Are you okay with this? Is this an accurate reflection of what we've just talked about? Would you want to change anything? Do you want to just sign to say that you've seen them and you're happy with them? Be aware of the relationships that we have with other people. In some of my darkest times, I had very poor relationships with the social workers. However, I had strong relationships with people like my midwife. I had 6 children, so I was a repeat customer. Clearly, she knew me well, but I had a very strong relationship with her. I had a good relationship with health visitor. I had a great relationship with my children's school. These were people that actually can be useful in terms of the assessment process. You don't always have to do a one-on-one. Could you think about, oh, well, actually, Mr. Smith has a really good relationship with the head teacher at the school. Let's see if the head teacher's free. Yeah, spoiler, the head teacher is unlikely to be free. Similar story with the GP, but still you can find another professional or somebody. It doesn't have to be a professional. It can be mum, auntie, neighbour across the road, Trisha up the street. It can be somebody that we feel very safe with, that's able to help the situation. So be aware of that. What could help your assessment? What could be useful to you? Don't dismiss the impact of our past experiences. Now, that can be past experiences with a local authority, or it could actually be our trauma that we've suffered as children or as young adults. Please don't dismiss that. We will sometimes respond in ways that are confusing or that you perhaps don't understand. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just the ways that we respond. So it's about learning about us as humans and learning what are the triggers, what are the right ways to talk to us. And you do have to learn that. You know, when you get a pet or when you bring a baby home, you don't instantly know who that person is. You've got to put the legwork in and get to know, okay, well, the baby likes to be held this way, or the cat likes to be fed. My cat likes to be fed in the dining room by itself. You know, he's such a fart, but he is. But I had to learn that. It took me a while to learn that. So don't dismiss the impact of our past experiences. Please remember that we don't know what comes next. We've never been in a social work degree course. We've never listened to social workers learn. So we don't know how long it takes to do an assessment. We don't know what the paper trail is. We don't know who you're going to talk to next. Those are things that actually, if we go back to the cup, that are really important to us. What's the trail? Equally think about when you think about delivering the decisions or recommendations, give us an idea of when that's going to be. Okay, so I'm going to finish my assessment on this date, and then on this date I'm going to put it through your door. You can read it when you're ready, or we can go through it together. And that's up to you. I'm touching on the last one there about creating a safe environment to receive your recommendations. Don't ask us a question about towels unless you absolutely have to. Don't ask us a needless question. Maybe choose, be discerning. Do you need to know this? Is it going to help your assessment, or is it just stuck there because it benefits the organisation? Do you really have to ask this? Is it actually going to drive a wedge between you and this person? Maybe don't ask it then, or maybe ask it in a different way. Keep us in the loop at all times. That goes back to communication. Drop us a text, drop us an email, keep talking to us. We need to know. This might be one of 20 assessments that you've got on the go. To us, it's one assessment. It's our life, it's our story. Don't ignore the power of shame. We've touched on that, and that will come more next week. You will talk about that more next week with Siobhan. You felt it yourself with that exercise that we did together. It's a very, very debilitating and excruciating pain. Don't ignore that. It's really tough. There's nothing tougher than having a social worker knock on your door and knowing that your neighbour's curtains are twitching. It's really tough. So it's not the ideal environment to then conduct an assessment. So just be aware of that. You've got lanyards, put them away. Don't need to be on display. You don't need to have a big flashing neon badge saying social worker. We're humans. So create a safe environment for us to receive your recommendations. So we've touched on that already. Think about the before and think about the during and think about the afterwards. Who have we got around us afterwards to look after us? Because that's really important, especially if the news isn't good. We do need to be supported. And even if you are the person that is recommending that the newborn baby is removed, this woman at 8.5 months pregnant needs to know that you still care and needs to hear that you're still on the end of the phone. Even if I hate you, I still need to know you're at the end of the phone and you've not given up on me. That's really important. And don't forget that this will stay with us forever. I will never forget pretty much all of the interactions that I've had with social workers over the years, and there have been hundreds. I don't forget the social workers' names. I don't forget the amount of social workers we've had, and I don't forget the interactions that were good and the interactions that were not so good, shall we say. These things stay with me forever. The last one is all about the core of me and the core of you, and that's don't forget your human kindness, and put that absolutely at the top of your list. Everything that we do should be with kindness. This is a tough old world that we live in, and it costs absolutely nothing to be kind, even if you are having to deal with the worst and most awful decisions and the most difficult, awful assessments, where children are in real danger and parents have very little insight. You can still be kind. You can still deal with that. There is more than one way to remove a baby. And I think that that's the sort of thing that should just be at your core, be in your gut at all times. So that's it from me. I'm going to let Siobhan close us up for the evening. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Annie. I know how much people are learning from you. I mean, I can't see the chat, but I'm sure that people are saying in the chat all of the things that they're learning. So thank you so much for sharing with us. So tonight we asked you on social media before you came in, we asked you, what does a cup have to do with assessment? What do towels have to do with assessment? And what's the three? And it's really, I suppose, the magic three. So for us, it's about 3 stages of assessment. Build the relationship, then gather your information, and then reach your decision or your recommendation. We looked at 3 models of assessment that are very traditional, been around for a long time, and there's also 3 sources of evidence really in triangulation, and then that takes us on to all the other triangles that get used in assessment in social work. So I suppose it's 3 is the magic number really for tonight. And so what we're going to ask you to do, because in other webinars we've been encouraging the 3 stages of reflection, haven't we? And those stages of reflection are reflection before, during and after. So having listened to the power of Annie's story, I want you all to think about 3 learning points from tonight that you can take away into your own practice. So if we were to ask you, what 3 things would you identify from tonight that you can take forward into your practice? And feel free to put those into the chat, to share those with each other if you've already got them in mind. And if not, go off and write those. If you've got a reflective journal, go and write a reflective account about tonight's webinar and what 3 things can you take from tonight as, if you like, learning points that you take away. We said earlier, and we had this image earlier, that sometimes assessment feels very scientific, it feels very dehumanized. It's all about goals and outcomes and evaluate and analyze and measuring things and planning and research, and it's all about that. But actually, what's behind all of that, the 3 things for me are relationships, relationships and relationships. And 3 of us together in a relationship, Annie and myself and Yusuf, who joined us in a previous webinar about analysis, worked on this book together, working towards accreditation, putting the pieces together. It's a workbook for children and families, social workers. We've talked about it before. I know that you've probably seen when we've talked about this before. But the 3 of us worked on it together, and if you've liked Annie's do's and don'ts tonight, then each chapter pretty much in that book, and you can see the list of chapters there, has Annie's advice, and it also has Paul's perspective. So we have that throughout the book, and you don't need to believe me, you can take it from tweets around how good this book is in terms of bringing together those relationships. So Yusuf having experienced care, and Annie sharing her thoughts and her advice for social workers. And I think it's probably going into the chat now, but this is on a special offer, and because 3 is the magic number, then we put it onto a special offer for 3 weeks, I think. And so the references that you might need are there. We will, as you know, if you attend regularly, you will get an email tomorrow that has all of the follow-up information and resources. I hope you've enjoyed tonight as much as I have. I'm always fascinated by how Annie can talk to us in ways that are so helpful to think about what we can learn. And I know everybody's learned from it, but it does lead us really nicely into next week's webinar, which is all about shame. We're going to look at the theory base of that, but we're going to have another spotlight next week, spotlight guest exploring the impact of shame. And I think it's an issue that is too often ignored in social work. And the following week, because I know lots of you like to know what's coming next, we're going to be looking at working with migrant children, which is such an important topic at the moment, as I know everybody will be conscious. And we're trying to address contemporary issues, but also issues of theory and reflection in our series of webinars. I do just want to also tonight say thank you very much to Mary, who has been a core member of our Social Work Student Connect team from the very beginning, and Mary is now in I suppose the full throes of employment now, Mary, having graduated, aren't you? And so tonight is going to be the last webinar where Mary is going to be live on the panel, just because of getting home in time from work and things, I think, Mary, but she's still going to be very much there and around, kind of supporting the Social Work Connect Student Connect team, because I know how important that is to all of us. So just as a formal thank you to Mary before she sort of ceases attending every week, just so that all the audience out there know that you may not see Mary on the panel again. So thank you very much to Mary. And I'm going to end things there, but I'm just going to hand over the final word to Annie. I don't know if you want to give us the quotation that you know I am always quoting you on, Annie, but you can say anything you want. You're in charge of concluding tonight's webinar.
Do you know what? I don't actually know what that quotation is. You'll have to say it. Which one is it? I'll say it what you know, Siobhan.
There's no us and them, there's only we. And I'm always quoting you on that. There is no
yes.
Just we.
Yeah, that's very true. Yes, there is no us and them. So there is no me and you. There should only be we or we. That's always been my favourite quote, and I use it frequently, although clearly not frequently enough because I've just forgotten it. But I do use it frequently. I think the last thing I'd like to say is thank you for choosing this path. Which is not an easy one, and it's a difficult profession to get into, and it's a difficult profession to stay in. So thank you actually for doing what you're doing, because you do make a massive difference to the lives of children, to the lives of families, to the lives of all of us that use services. You do make a difference. You can be that one person that believes in the child, the family member, the adult who uses services. You can be that one person that you might never have had anyone believe in you before. I know I never did, but you can make the difference. You can be the change. So thank you for all you do. Keep doing it. I wish you all the best of luck in your careers as students, and for those of you that are already experienced practitioners, keep doing what you're doing. Thank you very much for listening to me tonight, and I wish you all the best.
Good night, everyone.